All right, the topic for today is factoring. And so this is one of the biggest things that you always want to start out with, and I mean always. The first step to all factoring is to look for a greatest common factor. Now, that greatest common factor is going to be called your GCF. Sometimes you will have one, sometimes you will not, but you always want to look for this. And that is going to be a term or terms that are in common with all of your terms in your problem. All right, so let's look at some examples here. Starting with the first one, 4x squared plus 24x minus 16. All of these terms have a 4 in common, so we're going to start by writing down the 4. And then if you factor out a 4 out of this first term, you are left with just the x squared. Factoring a 4 out of the second term, you are left with a plus 6x. And then factoring a 4 out of the last term, you are left with a minus 4. And you could always check this answer, because if you redistribute, you should get what you started with, meaning 4 times the x squared would give you 4x squared. 4 times the 6x would give you the 24x. And 4 times the negative 4 would give you the negative 16. All right, so this is your factoring for this. All right, so the next problem, the greatest common factor here. All terms have a 3 in common, and they also have at least 1x. And so if you factor a 3x out of this first term, you are going to be left with 12x squared. And that's because 3 multiplied by the 12 will give you the 36, and then x times the x squared will give you the x cubed. All right, so now we have minus 3x, because 3x times 3x is 9x squared, and then a plus 5x. And then the last one here, GCF, we have a 7 that goes into all of these. We also have a y that is in all of the terms. So we factor out a 7y, leaving you with 5x squared plus 6x plus 8y squared. And once again, if you distribute, you'll get what you started with. All right, so that is always your first step to any factoring, is find out if there is a GCF with all the terms. All right, so the next type of factoring is going to be when you have two terms. One of the things you want to look for is there a difference of 2 squares? This is your formula for factoring a difference of 2 squares. A squared minus b squared equals a plus b times a minus b. All right, so let's look at the first problem here. There is no GCF to worry about in this first problem. Your a value in this will be the x. Your b value is going to be 6, because 6 squared is what would give you 36. Therefore, the factoring for this is going to be x plus 6 multiplied by x minus 6. For the next one, your a value is going to end up being 2x, because if you square a 2x, that means 2x times 2x, and that gives you 4x squared. Your b value in this is going to be 7, because 7 squared is going to give you 49. All right, so that comes down then to be 2x plus 7 multiplied by 2x minus 7. Now on the next problem here, we have a GCF that we need to take out. All right. The previous two problems did not have a GCF, but this one does. Both of these terms have a 2 in common, so we can factor 2 out of this problem. What that leaves us with then is x squared y squared minus 9z squared. Now this is going to be a difference of two squares here. Your a value, or what's going to be squared, your a value would be xy, because if you square xy, that would give you x squared y squared. Your b value in this situation is going to be 3z, because 3z times 3z gives you 9z squared. So the factoring comes down. The 2 will still stay outside of the parentheses. You're going to have xy plus 3z and xy minus 3z, and that will be our factoring for this. Now the fourth problem here has a 3 in common, so when you factor a 3 out, the first term becomes 25x squared minus, and then the second term is going to be 16y squared. Now 25x squared minus 16x squared is a difference of two squares. So that is going to go down to 5x plus 4y and 5x minus 4y. Alright, so the next type of factoring that we're going to take a quick look at is going to be when you have three terms in the form x squared plus bx plus c. B and c just represent constants or numbers that are going to be located in those positions. In this situation, we are going to have a leading coefficient of 1. Leading coefficient means the number in front of our first term, or the largest term, is going to be a 1. All right, so this is the way we're going to handle this. We're going to look for two numbers that will multiply together to give you this c value, and that will add together to give you this b value. So let's take a look at this first problem here. Now keep in mind, back in Algebra 1 you learned FOIL, so the first two terms, which means the number here and the number here, have to multiply together to give you the first term here. Well, the only way to get x squared is to multiply x times x. So those have to be the first terms. Alright, so now we're back to this yellow thing here. Two numbers that will multiply together to give us the c value. Alright, well the c value in this case is negative 28. So two numbers that will multiply together to give us negative 28 and add together to give us negative 3. That will be a negative 7 and a positive 4. Alright, applying the same idea here, x times x will give us the first term of x squared plus 3 and plus 4. These will multiply together to give you 12, and they will add together to give us positive 7x. I'm just going to run through these real quick. You may want to pause the video at this point and write them down, and then work them out and see if you get the answers that come up to here in a minute. Alright, so the first one's going to be y plus 11 times y plus 5. Then we'll get x minus 5 multiplied by x minus 5, which is the same thing as saying x minus 5 squared, because we're multiplying something by itself. The next problem, same idea, x plus 6 times x plus 6, which will give us x plus 6 squared because you're multiplying that parenthesis together. The next one is going to be x minus 12 multiplied by x plus 3. Now the last problem here, we have a GCF. On the previous 4 problems, we did not have one. This one we do. So we can factor out a 3x out of all of these terms. That will leave us with x squared minus 6x plus 8. Now we factor what is in the parentheses. So now we're just going to look at what is in the parenthesis right here. And let me put a 3x here in front. All right, so x times x, once again, is the only way to get this x squared. Two numbers that multiply to give us positive 8 and add to give us negative 6 will be a minus 4 and a minus 2. All right, a couple of more problems here. The next one, we have a GCF of 4x. Take that out, you are left with x cubed minus 4x squared minus 12. Because this is an x cubed, not an x squared, this is all the factoring that we can do on this particular problem here. All right, so the next one, we have a GCF of 6a and b. Take that out of the first term, you are left with a squared. On the second term, you are left with ab. On the last term, you are left with 6b squared. All right, so now let's see if we can factor this a little bit further. The only way to get a squared for your first term is to multiply a times a. Okay. All right, so then let's look at the number here. A negative 6, two numbers that will multiply to give you negative 6 and add to give you negative 1 would be a minus 3 and a positive 2. But we also have a b value on this because the negative 3b times the positive 2b, that will give us negative 6b squared. All right, so that's our factoring for that particular problem. So the next type of factoring is going to be similar to what we had on the previous problems. The difference here is that there will be a coefficient on the x squared besides just a 1. So this is a situation where the leading coefficient is not equal to 1. There are a lot of different methods that can be used for factoring this. I'm going to use what is called the box method. And we're going to start out with this particular problem to factor right here. 12x squared plus x minus 20. So the way we do this is we put the first term in the top left box. So we got a 12x squared here. The last term, which is negative 20, goes in the bottom right box. We then multiply those two numbers together, which will give us negative 240. And we want to find two numbers that will multiply together to give us 240, or negative 240, but will add together to give us this middle number here, which is a positive 1. Now you could go through an entire list of numbers that would multiply to give you 240, like 1 times 240, 2 times 120, 3 times 80. You can go through the whole list. the pair of numbers that will work here is going to be 15 times 16. And remember that since this is a negative 240, one of these two numbers would have to be a positive and the other one would have to be a negative in order to multiply together to give us negative 240. Well, since the middle term is a positive 1x, we want the 16 to be positive and the 15 to be negative. That is the pair of numbers that will work for this particular factoring. Now remember that this is really negative 240x squared because we multiplied these two things together. Now because you have an x squared here, you would need an x on each one of these terms here. So those are the two terms that go in these other two empty boxes. So you're going to have a negative 15x and a positive 16x. And it does not matter which term goes in which box. All right, so let's continue this over here. All right, so our next step that we're looking at here is to factor a GCF out of the top row. All right, so if we're looking at these two factors right here, the GCF would be a 3x. Both of these numbers are divisible by 3, and they both have at least one x. So 3x is our GCF. At this point, this square just becomes a multiplication table. So we're trying to figure out 3x multiplied by what would give us this 12x squared. And that value would be a 4x. Now we figure out 3x multiplied by what will give us negative 15x. And that would be a negative 5. All right, so in the next one, in the last spot, this number multiplied by 4x has to give us 16x. And that would be a positive 4. And also, this positive 4 multiplied by the negative 5 gives you this negative 20 in this box. Well, the stuff that is outside of the box, those are your factors for this particular problem. So you're going to have 3x plus 4 multiplied by 4x minus 5. That is your factoring. Okay. All right, let's look at another one. In the top left box, you're going to have 6x squared. The bottom right box will be negative 5. We multiply these two things together, which will be a negative 30. Remember, there's an x squared on that, but I'm not going to mess with the x squared part of this. We need two numbers that will multiply together to give us negative 30, and then we'll add together to give us a positive 13. Remember, since this is a negative number, one of these values will have to be negative and one of them will have to be positive. So let's just run through the list of numbers that multiply together to give us 30. It's not a long list. So 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, 4 does not go into 30, 5 times 6. There are only 4 sets of numbers that will multiply together to give us 30. The combination that's going to work for this situation and give us a positive 13 is not the 3 and 10, because remember, one of those numbers has to be negative and one of them has to be positive. That won't give us a 13. But 2 and 15 will, if we make the 15 positive and the 2 negative. So in one of the boxes we're going to put 15x, and the other box we're going to put negative 2x. So your next step is to find a GCF in the top row. That GCF is going to be 3x. Now it's a multiplication table. 3x multiplied by what will give us 6x squared. That will be 2x. 3x multiplied by what will give us 15x. And that will be plus 5. And then what value multiplied by 2x will give us negative 2x? And that would be a negative 1. Therefore, your factoring is 2x plus 5 from up here, multiplied by 3x minus 1, which is this part right here. All right, let's do another one here. The 12x squared goes in your first box here. The 2 goes in your last box. And then we multiply those values together, which is 24. All right, so find all the factors. 1 times 24, 2 times 12, 3 times 8, 6 times 4. Let me put it in the right order here. 4 times 6. And that's it. That's all the factors. We need our factors to combine to give us this 11 right here. That combination will be the 3x and 8x. So now take a GCF out of the top row. That's going to be 3x. Now the multiplication table. 3x times what will give us this? We got a 4x. 3x times what will give us 3x? That will be a positive 1. And then what number times 4x will give us 8x? And that will be a positive 2. And also 2 multiplied by 1 will give us this 2 right here. All right, so the factoring we have is going to be 3x plus 2 multiplied by 4x plus 1. All right, hopefully this will help you get started on your factoring.